They say redemption requires suffering. What they don't tell you is that some sins demand an eternity of agony, and I am living proof that the Imperium's mercy is more terrible than its wrath. My name was Brother Matthias Cord, and I served the Emperor as a medicae in the Frateris militia attached to the Order of the Bloody Rose. I saved lives, I bound wounds, I whispered prayers over dying soldiers and gave them comfort in their final moments. But one mistake, one terrible accident born of chaos and fear transformed me from a servant of mercy into an engine of endless torment. The field hospital on Cronus 4 was drowning in blood and screams when it happened. Our forces had been retreating for 3 days straight, the chaos warband known as the Crimson Tide pushing us back kilometer by kilometer through the ash wastes. The wounded came in waves that never seemed to end, men with limbs torn away by chain axes, soldiers whose armor had fused to their flesh from melt-a-burns, guardsmen driven mad by the whispers of demons they had witnessed on the battlefield. I had not slept in 40 hours. My hands shook as I prepared the next round of medications. Around me, the other medicae and field surgeons moved with the same exhausted precision, our white robes stained red and black with the blood and soot of war. The injured covered every surface of our medical tent. They lay on cots, on the floor, some propped against supply crates because we had run out of space to put them. The artillery strikes were getting closer. Each explosion made the tent walls ripple and sent fresh dust cascading from the ceiling. We could hear the enemy advancing, their battle cries mixing with the screams of our dying brothers. The evacuation order had come through an hour ago, but we refused to leave until every soldier who could be moved was ready for transport. That's when Private Marcus was brought in. He was young, maybe 19 standard years, with a lost burn across his chest that had scorched through his flak armor. His breathing came in wet gasps that told me his lungs were damaged. He needed the respirator stimulant immediately, or he would drown in his own blood within minutes. I reached for the medication cabinet, my vision blurring from exhaustion. The vials all looked the same in the flickering light of the emergency lamps. I grabbed what I thought was the respirator stimulant and loaded it into the injector. My hands were steady despite my fatigue. I had performed this procedure 1,000 times before. The injection went smoothly. I whispered a prayer to the Emperor and moved on to the next patient. Behind me, I heard Private Marcus take a deep breath. I smiled, thinking the medication had worked. Then I heard him scream. It was not the scream of a man in pain. It was the scream of a man whose insides were turning to liquid fire. I spun around and saw his body convulsing on the cot, his back arching so violently that I heard his spine crack. Foam poured from his mouth, black and thick like oil. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and his fingers clawed at his own throat as if he could tear out whatever poison was destroying him from within. I rushed to his side, but there was nothing I could do. The damage was already done. Within 30 seconds, he stopped moving. His body went limp, and the awful screaming stopped. Private Marcus was dead. I looked down at the injector still in my hand and felt ice spread through my chest. I had grabbed the wrong vial. Instead of respirator stimulant, I had given him a massive dose of combat adrenaline mixed with a clotting agent. The combination had caused his blood to thicken and his heart to explode inside his chest. The tent fell silent except for the moans of the other wounded. Every eye was on me. I stood there, frozen, unable to process what I had just done. Then another patient started screaming, and another, and another. I had not just treated Private Marcus. In my exhausted state, I had prepared an entire batch of medications using the wrong vial, 47 doses. I had already administered 23 of them to wounded soldiers throughout the tent. As I watched in horror, they began to die one by one, their bodies reacting to the poison I had put into their veins with my own hands. The other medici tried to save them. They pumped counteragents and performed emergency surgery and prayed with a desperation I had never heard before. But nothing worked. The damage was too severe, too sudden. Within 10 minutes, all 23 soldiers were dead. 23 men who had survived the battlefield only to be killed by the healer who was supposed to save them. I fell to my knees in the blood that pooled across the tent floor. My hands were shaking so badly that I could not make them stop. The chief medic grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me to my feet. His face was pale beneath his hood, his eyes filled with something between pity and disgust. The evacuation happened in a blur. We loaded the surviving wounded onto transports and fled before the Chaos forces could overrun our position. I sat in the back of a cargo hauler surrounded by the bodies of the men I had killed. They had covered the corpses with white sheets, but blood was already seeping through the fabric. 47 sheets. 47 lives ended by my mistake. The guilt was a living thing inside my chest, crushing me from the inside. I could not eat. I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Private Marcus convulsing on the cot, his face twisted in agony as the poison I gave him destroyed his body. I saw the other soldiers dying around me, calling out for help that would never come. I heard their screams echoing in my mind like a prayer that would never be answered. The Ecclesiarchy Tribunal came 3 weeks later. I was brought before 5 senior members of the church, their faces hidden beneath ornate masks that made them look more like statues than men. They sat behind a long table made of black stone, and between us was nothing but empty space and silence. The charges were read aloud by a confessor whose voice echoed through the judgment chamber. Criminal negligence resulting in the deaths of 47 Imperial soldiers. Failure to maintain proper protocols during medical treatment. Dereliction of duty in a time of war. Each word fell on me like a hammer blow, and I could not deny any of them. They were all true. The chief medic testified on my behalf. He explained the impossible conditions we had faced, the exhaustion that had clouded my judgment, the chaos of the retreat that had made proper protocols nearly impossible to follow. He begged the tribunal to show mercy, to recognize that I had served faithfully for 12 years before this tragedy occurred. But the facts were undeniable. 47 men were dead because of my actions. Their families would never see them again. Their brothers in arms had watched them die in a medical tent that was supposed to be a place of healing. The Imperium demanded justice, and justice required punishment. The lead judge spoke in a voice like grinding stone. The penalty for your crimes would normally be death by firing squad. However, the Ecclesiarchy recognizes that you acted without malice or corruption. Your soul remains pure despite your failure. Therefore, you are offered a choice. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. A choice meant there was something other than execution. A chance, however small, to make amends for what I had done. The first option is immediate death. Quick and clean, your suffering ends and you face the Emperor's judgment with whatever grace he chooses to grant you. The second option is redemption through service. You will be bound to a penitent engine and fight in the Emperor's wars until your sins are washed clean in the blood of his enemies. The choice is yours. I should have asked questions. I should have demanded to know what a penitent engine actually was, what binding meant, how long the service would last. But the guilt was eating me alive from the inside, and the thought of dying without atoning for my sins was unbearable. The faces of the 47 soldiers haunted every moment of my waking life. I needed to make it right somehow to prove that their deaths had not been completely meaningless. I choose redemption, I said. My voice was steady despite the fear that coiled in my stomach. I will serve until my sins are forgiven. The judges nodded as if they had expected this answer. The chief medic made a small sound that might have been a sob, but when I looked at him, his face was carefully blank. Only his eyes betrayed him, and what I saw there was not hope, but something closer to grief. You have chosen the path of the penitent, the lead judge said. May the Emperor find you worthy, Brother Matthias Cord. Your transformation begins immediately. I was taken from the judgment chamber to a medical facility deep beneath the Cathedral of Saint Aspira. The halls were white and sterile, lit by harsh lights that made my eyes water. Tech priests in red robes moved through the corridors alongside chirurgeons whose hands were more metal than flesh. They did not speak to me as they led me to a chamber at the center of the complex. The room was circular and dominated by a massive piece of machinery in its center. It looked like a walking throne made of steel and pain, standing 3 meters tall on piston-driven legs. Massive weapons were mounted where arms should be. Heavy flamers that could burn entire squads to ash. Buzzsaws designed to cut through armor and bone with equal ease. The whole contraption was covered in chains and purity seals, and at its heart was a cruciform restraint frame with manacles and chains designed to hold a body strapped to its front, fully exposed to enemy fire and the Emperor's judgment. "This is a Penitent engine," one of the tech priests explained. His voice was mechanical, filtered through speakers in his throat. "Your body will be shackled to the restraint frame and pierced with neural connectors. Your spine and brain will be hardwired directly into the engine's weapon systems. Pain amplifiers will be installed along your nervous system to ensure you remain conscious and penitent at all times. Combat stimulants will be administered automatically to drive you forward in battle. You will serve until your superiors deem your penance complete." The words washed over me like ice water. Strapped to the front, pain amplifiers, exposed to everything. I tried to speak, to ask how long the service would last, but my throat had closed up with terror. One of the chirurgeons stepped forward with a syringe filled with clear fluid. "This will keep you conscious during the procedure," he said. "It is important that you feel every moment of your transformation. Suffering is the path to redemption, and you must walk it fully aware." The injection burned as it entered my arm. My vision swam, but I did not lose consciousness. Instead, everything became sharp and clear and terrible. I could see every detail of the room, every scratch on the Penitent engine's armor, every stain on the chirurgeon's robes. They strapped me to a surgical table that tilted upward so I was nearly vertical. I could see everything they were going to do to me. The chirurgeons moved forward with their tools, saws, and drills and things I had no names for. The chief medici appeared at the edge of my vision. He reached out and took my hand, his grip tight and desperate. "May the Emperor find you worthy, Matthias," he whispered. His voice broke on my name. "I am so sorry." Then the cutting began. They worked with practiced precision, opening my flesh to install the neural connectors that would bind me to the machine. I felt every incision, every insertion of metal into nerve tissue, every connection being forged between my organic body and the engine's systems. The pain was beyond anything I had imagined, beyond anything language could describe. But the drugs kept me awake and aware, forced to witness my own transformation. They pierced my arms with thick cables that burrowed into muscle and bone, creating direct pathways from my nervous system to the engine's weapon mounts. My spine was opened and implanted with a network of pain amplifiers, devices designed to magnify every sensation until agony became my constant companion. My skull was drilled and fitted with neural interface ports that would connect my brain directly to the engine's targeting systems and sensory feeds. Through it all, I screamed. The sound echoed off the chamber walls, mixing with the mechanical noises of the surgery and the whispered prayers of the tech priests. But no one stopped. No one offered comfort or relief. This was my penance, and I had chosen it. When the internal work was complete, they lifted my transformed body and carried me to the Penitent engine. The restraint frame waited like an embrace made of iron and judgment. They positioned me against it, my back pressed to the cold metal, my arms spread wide in a parody of the Emperor's benediction. The manacles closed around my wrists and ankles with heavy clicks that sounded like prison doors slamming shut. Then came the final connections. Cables snaked from the engine into the ports they had installed in my body, linking flesh to machine with bonds that could never be broken without killing what remained of me. I felt the engine systems come online, felt them merge with my own nervous system until I could no longer tell where my body ended and the machine began. The weapons became extensions of my will. The flamers responded to thoughts I had not yet fully formed. The saws hummed with potential energy that I could feel in my bones. But beneath it all ran that river of constant pain, amplified by the devices in my spine until it filled every corner of my consciousness. They activated the Penitent engine fully, and I felt myself lifted upright as the mechanical legs took my weight. I stood 3 meters tall now, a walking monument to sin and punishment. My body was completely exposed on the front of the frame, vulnerable to everything the battlefield might throw at me. There would be no protection, no shelter, no hiding from the consequences of what I had become. The chief medici stepped in front of me one last time. Tears streamed down his face as he looked up at what I had become. "Go with the Emperor's grace, Matthias," he said. "May your service bring you the redemption you seek." I tried to answer him, to thank him for his kindness, to say goodbye to the life I had known. But the voice that emerged from my throat was not my own. The engine had taken even that from me, replacing my words with synthesized shrieks that conveyed only anguish and rage. The sound was terrible, inhuman, a mechanical scream that spoke of suffering without end. And in that moment, strapped to the front of a war machine designed to turn penance into violence, I understood the true nature of the choice I had made. This was not redemption. This was transformation into a weapon that would know nothing but pain and battle until the day it was finally destroyed. I had traded a quick death for an eternity of agony, and there was no going back. The tech priests began the final rituals, anointing my exposed flesh with sacred oils and marking the engine's armor with purity seals. They chanted prayers in languages I did not understand, calling down the Emperor's blessing on this union of flesh and steel. But I barely heard them. The pain had already begun its work, teaching me the first lesson of my new existence. There would be no rest, no peace, no moment free from suffering. This was my penance, and I would bear it for as long as the ecclesiarchy deemed necessary. Whether that meant months or years or decades, I had no way of knowing. All I knew was that Brother Matthias Cord, the medic who had tried to save lives, was gone. In his place stood something new and terrible, a penitent engine, a weapon of faith and fury, a monument to the Imperium's merciless mercy. And as they led me from the chamber toward whatever battlefield awaited, I began to scream. The sound never truly stopped after that. I woke to fire and screaming, but the screaming was my own. My body was moving before my mind could understand where I was or what had happened. Every sensor in my transformed form blazed with input, overwhelming my thoughts with a flood of information I could not process. Temperature readings, threat assessments, ammunition counts, target acquisition data. All of it crashed into my consciousness like a tidal wave, while beneath it all ran a river of pure agony that had no beginning and no end. The pain was not like anything I had experienced before. It was not the sharp sting of a cut or the dull throb of a bruise. This was pain that existed in every nerve ending simultaneously, amplified by the devices they had installed along my spine until it became the only reality I could perceive. My legs were gone, replaced by the piston-driven limbs of the engine that hissed and clanked with each step. My arms were shackled to the frame, pierced through with neural connectors that turned them into conduits for the weapons I could feel as extensions of my body but could not control the way I once controlled fingers and hands. Even my voice was gone, stolen by the transformation and replaced by synthesized shrieks that poured from speakers mounted somewhere in the chassis behind me. I was on a battlefield. The world around me was smoke and lost fire and the thunder of explosions that shook the ground beneath my mechanical feet. Heretics in ragged uniforms fired at me from behind barricades made of rubble and scrap metal. Their bullets struck my exposed flesh, tearing through skin and muscle. I felt each impact as searing agony layered on top of the constant suffering. My armor plating protected the engine's vital systems, but I was strapped to the front of the frame, completely vulnerable to enemy fire. There would be no shelter, no protection, only exposure and pain. Then the chemicals hit my system and everything changed. I felt the stimulants flood through tubes connected directly to what remained of my organic body. Battle rage inducers, adrenaline synthesizers, pain magnifiers that took the already unbearable agony and multiplied it tenfold. My vision went red at the edges, and a sound came from my speakers that was supposed to be a scream but emerged as a mechanical roar that echoed across the battlefield. The pain became a living thing inside me, a beast with teeth and claws that tore at my consciousness from within. But I discovered something terrible in that moment. When I moved forward, when I advanced toward the enemy, the pain lessened just slightly. Not enough to bring relief, but enough to make motion preferable to stillness. The engine was designed this way, I realized with horror. The agony drove me forward like a rider drives a horse with spurs. The only escape from the worst of the suffering was to fight. My flamers activated without conscious thought. Twin streams of burning promethium erupted from the weapons mounted to the engine's arms, the neural connections in my shackled limbs translating my desperate need for relief into deadly fire. The flames washed over the heretic positions like a wave of liquid death, consuming everything they touched. I heard the enemy screaming as they burned, their voices high and terrible and somehow familiar. The sound mixed with my own mechanical shrieks until I could not tell where their agony ended and mine began. I advanced through the burning wreckage, the engine's feet crushing debris and bodies with equal indifference. The heretics tried to fall back, but the chemicals in my system would not let me stop. I pursued them through the ruins of what had once been a shrine dedicated to the Emperor's glory. The walls were covered in blasphemous symbols painted in blood, and part of my mind registered that this desecration should fill me with righteous fury. But I felt nothing except the pain and the chemical-driven need to destroy everything in my path. A group of heretics made a stand in what remained of the shrine's nave. They had heavy weapons, stubbers that could punch through the engine's armor and tear through my exposed body if given enough time. They opened fire as I entered, the rounds hammering against the chassis and ripping into my flesh. I felt each impact as data and as agony. My systems automatically calculating the damage to both machine and organic components. Blood ran down my legs from wounds I could not reach to staunch, dripping onto the stone floor as I advanced. The buzzsaws mounted to the engine's arms screamed to life, their blades spinning so fast they became invisible blurs. I crashed into their formation like a battering ram. The saws cut through flesh and bone as easily as they cut through the air. Blood sprayed across my face and body, temporarily blinding me, but the targeting systems fed directly into my brain switched to thermal imaging without pause. I could see the heat signatures of the enemy through my neural interface, watch them scatter and fall and die beneath weapons I controlled through pain and desperation. And then, in a moment of terrible clarity between the waves of chemicals, I felt something that should have been impossible. The Penitent engine fed their pain back to me through the neural connectors pierced through my arms and spine. As they burned and bled and died, I experienced echoes of their suffering layered on top of my own. It was a feedback loop of agony designed to ensure that even in killing the Emperor's enemies, I found no relief from my penance. Every death I inflicted added to my torment rather than diminishing it. The battle ended when there were no more targets to destroy. My weapons fell silent, the flamers cooling and the saws spinning down to a stop. The chemicals began to fade from my system, leaving me standing alone in a field of corpses and ash. For a moment, I tried to understand what had just happened, tried to reconcile the violence I had inflicted with the healer I had once been. But the pain was too great, too all-consuming. It filled every space in my mind where thoughts should have lived. I wanted to weep, but I had no tears. I wanted to scream, but my voice was not my own anymore. I wanted to die, but death was not an option they had given me. Instead, I simply stood there, locked inside this walking nightmare of metal and torment, my body exposed and bleeding on the front of the frame, waiting for whatever would come next. They came for me as the sun set over the battlefield. Sisters Repentia in their ragged robes, their bodies covered in scars and marks of penance. They attached chains to the engine's chassis and led me away from the carnage like handlers leading a dangerous animal. I tried to speak to them, to ask questions, to beg for some kind of explanation. But my speakers only produced those awful synthesized shrieks, and the sisters turned their faces away as if the sound caused them physical pain. We walked for hours through the ruins. The engine's mechanical legs never tired, though the joints hissed and groaned with each step. The pain never faded. If anything, it seemed to grow worse in the absence of the battle stimulants, becoming a constant pressure that squeezed my consciousness like a fist. I tried to count my steps to distract myself from the suffering, but I kept losing track somewhere past 1,000. Numbers became meaningless when every moment contained infinity. Eventually, we reached a massive cathedral that rose from the ashes like a mountain of stone and faith. Its walls were scarred by battle but still standing, covered in statues of saints and heroes whose carved faces looked down with expressions that might have been pity or judgment. The sisters led me through a side entrance sized for war engines, and we descended stairs that went down and down into the earth, the temperature dropping with each level until my exposed skin registered near freezing conditions. Through sensors, I could no longer fully distinguish from my own flesh. The chamber at the bottom was vast and echoing, carved from solid rock and lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. And in that chamber stood other penitent engines. Dozens of them, maybe more, each one locked into position by massive chains bolted directly to the floor. Pilots were strapped to the fronts of their frames just as I was, their bodies exposed and pierced with the same neural connectors that bound me to my machine. They were arranged in rows like some terrible choir, and as we entered I heard them singing. Not words, but the same mechanical shrieks that came from my own speakers. A symphony of suffering that rose and fell in waves, filling the chamber with a sound that was almost musical in its horror. The sisters chained the engine into place between two others. One was ancient, its armor plating worn smooth by what must have been many years of use, covered in purity seals so old the wax had turned black. The pilot strapped to its front was barely recognizable as human anymore, their flesh scarred and marked by decades of exposure to battle and the elements. The other engine looked newer, its metal still shining, its weapons freshly blessed with sacred oils. The pilot was a young man whose eyes still held awareness and terror in equal measure. As soon as the chains locked the engine into place, I felt something shift in my systems. The standing position I was forced to maintain sent fresh jolts of pain through my transformed body, but there was no relief in movement anymore. The engine could not pace or shift weight. I could only stand and endure, my body held upright by the restraints that bound me to the frame. The sisters left without a word, their footsteps fading up the stairs until silence fell over the chamber. But it was not true silence. The other engines continued their awful chorus, and I found myself joining them without meaning to. The pain demanded expression, and the speakers were the only outlet I possessed. My shrieks added to theirs, and together we sang a song that no human should ever have to hear. Time stopped meaning anything in that place. There was no day or night in the depths, only the endless now of suffering. I tried to sleep, desperately yearning for the unconsciousness that might grant me a few moments of peace. But sleep would not come. The chemicals they had put in my system included stimulants that kept my mind alert and aware no matter how exhausted I became. I was trapped in a state of permanent wakefulness, unable to escape into dreams or darkness. I tried to pray, silently forming the words in my mind the way I had been taught in my youth. But the prayers felt hollow, meaningless sounds that dissolved before they could take shape. How could I pray to the Emperor when every moment of my existence was agony? How could I ask for his mercy when this torture was supposedly his will? The questions circled in my mind like carrion birds, finding no answers and leaving only doubt in their wake. After what might have been days or weeks, figures appeared in the chamber. Tech priests in crimson robes moved between the Penitent engines with tools and sacred oils, performing maintenance with mechanical precision. They checked the engine's systems, repaired damage sustained in battle, and whispered prayers to machine spirits in binary cant. Behind them came a sister in the robes of a dialogues, marked by the book and quill emblem that identified her as one of the Order's scholars and orators. Her face was kind, lined with age and wisdom, and she moved between the engines with careful steps. Her purpose different from the tech priests. While they worked on the machines with wrenches and diagnostic equipment, she carried only a censer of blessed incense and vials of anointing oil. She stopped before each engine, reading litanies in high Gothic, anointing the weapons with oil, and most importantly, looking up at the pilots strapped to the frames to check if consciousness and awareness still remained behind their eyes. When she reached me, she paused and looked directly at my face. For a long moment, we simply regarded each other, and I wondered what she saw when she looked at me. Did she see a weapon, a sinner being punished? Or did she see the man I had once been, trapped inside this mechanical nightmare? "Can you still hear me?" she asked quietly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she feared being overheard by the tech priests working nearby. "Can you understand my words?" I tried to answer, tried to force my speakers to produce something other than shrieks. What emerged was a broken, distorted sound that might have been yes or might have been nothing. But the sister's eyes widened slightly, and I knew she had heard something in that noise that told her I was still aware inside this prison. "My name is Sister Mara," she said, beginning to anoint the flamer barrels mounted to my engine with blessed oils. Her touch was gentle, reverent, treating the weapons as sacred instruments rather than tools of death. "I tend to the souls of the Penitent engines between their deployments. The tech priests maintain your machines, but I am here for what remains of the person within. I cannot ease your suffering, child. That is not permitted. But I can offer you prayers and the knowledge that you are not forgotten." I wanted to ask her so many questions. How long had I been here? How many battles had I fought? When would my penance be complete? But I could not form the words, could not make my voice work the way I needed it to. All I could manage was a single word, forced through the speakers with every bit of will I possessed. "Please." The word came out wrong, stretched and metallic and barely recognizable. But Sister Mara understood. Her expression crumbled for just a moment, grief flashing across her face before she composed herself again. She reached out and placed one hand against my shoulder, against my bare skin rather than the engine's metal. The touch was so gentle it registered as barely a whisper through the constant pain. "The canoness says you have served 3 months," she said softly, her voice carrying both comfort and something that looked like carefully hidden knowledge. "Perhaps your penance will be deemed sufficient soon. Perhaps you will find peace." 3 months. The number crashed into my awareness like a thunderbolt. Only 3 months had passed since my transformation, though it felt like years had ground by in that time. But Sister Mara's eyes held something that looked like pity mixed with truth she did not want to share. Her words said soon, but her expression suggested she did not believe my penance would end quickly. She was offering me hope because she had nothing else to give, and we both knew it was a kindness built on uncertainty. She finished anointing my weapons and whispered a final prayer over me before moving on to the next engine. I watched her go, this woman who showed compassion to machines of war and the tortured souls strapped to them. The tech priests continued their work with mechanical efficiency, but Sister Mara brought something different to the chamber. She brought acknowledgement that we were still human, still deserving of some small measure of dignity despite what had been done to us. After she left, I was alone again with my thoughts and the endless chorus of mechanical screaming. 3 months felt like eternity, and I had no way of knowing how many more eternities stretched before me. The thought was crushing, unbearable. I tried to reject it, to convince myself that surely my service would end after a year or perhaps 2. But doubt had taken root in my mind, and it grew like poison in fertile soil. The next battle came without warning. One moment I was locked in the chamber of engines. The next, the tech priests were releasing my chains and the Sisters Repentia were guiding the engine up the stairs into blinding daylight. My systems activated automatically, weapons priming and targeting software coming online. The stimulants flooded my body before I even knew what enemy we would face. Through fragmentary reports on the Vox network, I heard mentions of tyrannids, of a swarm that had descended on an agri-world and needed to be purged before it could spread further. I barely processed the information. The chemicals were already flooding my system, the familiar cocktail of stimulants and rage inducers and pain magnifiers that transformed me from a suffering penitent into a weapon of war. The agony spiked to levels that should have caused unconsciousness, but the stimulants kept me aware and alert, forced to experience every moment of torment. My speakers began their mechanical screaming before we even reached the battlefield. The tyrannids came in waves of chitin and claws, alien monsters that moved with terrible purpose. They were fast and deadly, designed by some cruel evolution to be perfect killers. But I was designed for this too. Crafted specifically to fight and kill and burn. My flamers lit the sky with fire, creating walls of flame that consumed the smaller creatures. My saws tore through the larger beasts, cutting them apart even as their acid blood hissed against the engine's armor and burned my exposed flesh where it splashed. I fought alongside another Penitent engine, a massive war machine that moved with practiced efficiency through the swarm. Its pilot was completely covered in scars, their body a map of many years of battle damage and exposure. Between waves of enemies, I found myself studying this other engine with the fragment of consciousness that still remained capable of observation. Its armor was decorated with kill markings and purity seals, dozens of them, hundreds maybe. Some of the seals were so old they had turned to dust, held in place only by the wax that had originally affixed them to the metal. When the fighting paused for just a moment, I moved the engine closer to read the inscription on the other machine's shrine plaque. The words were worn but still legible, etched into a brass plate mounted on its chassis below where the pilot hung in their restraints. Brother Gregorius Val, it read. Many years of faithful service. May his penance cleanse all sins many years. The vague phrase hit me with unexpected force, but it was the pilot himself who truly drove the message home. I looked at Brother Gregorius's scarred face, at eyes that held awareness but seemed to look through me rather than at me, at a body that had been exposed to the elements and enemy fire for longer than I could imagine. This man had been strapped to the front of a Penitent engine for years, perhaps decades. Through countless battles and endless suffering, denied the mercy of death that most engines found quickly on the battlefield. The truth crystallized in my mind with perfect, horrible clarity. This was not penance that would end after months or even a few years. The Penitent engines were designed as suicide assault platforms, meant to find redemptive death in battle, but not all of them died quickly. Some, like Brother Gregorius, survived battle after battle. Their suffering extended far beyond what anyone expected. The 3 months I had served were nothing. I could be here for years, locked in this cycle of battle and suffering, with only the slim hope that eventually an enemy's weapon would find me and grant the death that ended my service. The chemicals surged stronger in response to my distress, flooding my system with compounds designed to override thought with pure aggression. I felt my awareness beginning to fracture, my sense of self starting to dissolve under the chemical onslaught. And in that moment of dissolution, I understood something terrible. The rage and violence felt better than the despair. The mindless fury was a relief from the horror of understanding my fate, so I stopped fighting it. I surrendered to the chemicals and let them transform me into exactly what the engine wanted me to be. A weapon without thought, a killer without conscience, a thing that existed only to burn and cut and destroy. The Tyranids fell before me in heaps, their alien bodies no match for the mechanical fury I unleashed. And for those few hours of battle I felt something other than despair. I felt purpose, however twisted and terrible that purpose might be. When the battle ended and they chained me back in the deep chamber, Sister Mara came again with her oils and prayers. But this time, when she looked into my eyes, I saw her expression change. She saw something different there, something that had shifted during the battle. The awareness was still present, but it was colder now, more distant. I was beginning the transformation that I had seen in Brother Gregorius's eyes. The slow change from person to weapon, from consciousness to function. Sister Mara whispered her prayers over me with particular care that day, as if she understood what was happening and mourned it. But she could do nothing to stop it. This was the path I had chosen, and the Penitent engine would take me to its inevitable end, whether that came in the next battle or decades from now. The battle for Cardinal World Sanctus came like all the others. Announced only by the activation of my systems and the familiar flood of chemicals that turned thought into rage. But this time, something was different. The scale was larger, the stakes higher, the enemy more terrible than any I had faced before. Word-bearers, the sisters who prepared us, whispered with fear in their voices. Chaos Space Marines who had turned from the Emperor's light and embraced damnation. They came with demon engines and cultist hordes, determined to corrupt this holy world and turn its cathedrals into shrines of darkness. I was deployed with the full Penitent engine squadron, 12 of us in total. We stood in formation outside the primary cathedral as the enemy advanced across the pilgrim plaza that had once seen millions of faithful come to worship. Now it was empty except for us and the approaching tide of corruption. Through my neural interface, I could see them with enhanced clarity. Red armor marked with blasphemous symbols, moving with the confidence of warriors who had fought for 10,000 years. The chemicals hit differently this time, harder, more intense. I felt the stimulants and rage inducers pour into my system in quantities I had never experienced before. The pain magnifiers activated at maximum setting, sending my suffering to levels that should have destroyed my mind. But instead of breaking me, something inside me shifted. The agony transformed into something else, something that felt almost like power. For so long I had fought against the pain, trying to endure it while maintaining some scrap of who I had been. Now I simply let go. The transformation was immediate and total. I stopped being Brother Matthias Cord, the medicae who had made a terrible mistake. I became the engine, the weapon, the instrument of destruction that the ecclesiarchy had created from my broken body. When the order came to advance, I moved forward with the others, not out of chemical compulsion, but out of choice. I chose the violence. I chose the rage. I chose to become the monster because being the monster hurt less than remembering I had once been human. We crashed into the Chaos Marine lines like a hammer striking an anvil. My flamers bathed their ancient armor in promethium fire hot enough to melt ceramite. My saws screamed as they bit into power armor that had survived centuries of warfare. Enemy fire tore into my exposed body, rounds punching through flesh and shattering bone, but I did not slow. The pain was still there, constant and overwhelming, but I had learned to channel it into fury rather than let it paralyze me. The word-bearers fought back with bolters and demon-possessed weapons, but we were 12 engines of pure aggression driving forward through their formation without fear or hesitation. I felt no anger at their blasphemy. I felt no righteous fury at their corruption. I felt only the pure simplicity of destruction, the mechanical satisfaction of targets acquired and eliminated. A Chaos Marine tried to stand against me, his armor covered in prayers to dark gods written in languages that hurt to perceive even through my sensors. I burned him without pause, watching his ancient armor blacken and crack. He screamed something that might have been a curse or a prayer, but I could not tell the difference anymore and did not care. The battle raged through the streets of the Holy City, our squadron pushing deeper into enemy territory with each passing hour. We fought past corrupted shrines and defiled monuments, through squares where statues of saints had been pulled down and replaced with obscene idols. The word-bearers kept trying to form defensive lines, but we broke through each one with mechanical inevitability. Nothing could stop 12 Penitent engines once they had been unleashed. Enemy fire continued to tear into my body, my blood mixing with promethium and spent shell casings on the ground, but I advanced regardless. During a lull in the fighting, I found myself near a small chapel that had somehow remained untouched by the chaos. Through the shattered windows, I could see the interior. There were bodies inside, civilians who had sought sanctuary and found only death. They lay in rows before the altar, their hands still clasped in final prayers that the Emperor had not answered. Among them were children, small forms wrapped in the simple robes of pilgrims. Something flickered in the depths of my consciousness. A memory of who I had been, what I had valued, the lives I had sworn to protect. For just a moment I felt the weight of what I had become. These people had died while I was out there killing with mechanical efficiency, transformed into a weapon that could not distinguish between necessary violence and mindless slaughter. The guilt tried to surface, tried to remind me that I was supposed to be seeking redemption, not reveling in destruction. Then the chemicals surged again and the moment passed. The bodies became statistics, tactical data about enemy movements and civilian casualties. The chapel became just another structure in my threat assessment matrix. I moved on without looking back, my weapons ready for the next wave of enemies. Whatever had stirred in my consciousness was buried again beneath the drugs and the pain and the overwhelming need to keep fighting. We reached the enemy command post as the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of blood and fire. It was a fortified position built around a corrupted cathedral, its walls reinforced with dark iron and demon bone. The word-bearers had concentrated their forces here for a final stand, and we could see dozens of Chaos Marines arrayed in defensive positions. They opened fire as we approached, bolt rounds and plasma blasts hammering against our armor and tearing into our exposed bodies. I advanced through the storm of fire without slowing. A bolt round punched through my shoulder, destroying muscle and nerve. Another took me in the leg, shattering my femur. The impacts registered as damage reports scrolling across my awareness, but my ability to care about injury to my organic body had been eroded by months of constant suffering. Blood poured from my wounds, but the engine's legs kept moving, driven by hydraulics and my neural commands. My flamers answered the enemy guns with streams of burning death, setting their defensive positions ablaze. The saws found purchase in armor and flesh, cutting through both without distinction. A word-bearer champion stepped forward to challenge me, his armor covered in trophies taken from loyalist space marines over millennia of warfare. He wielded a demon weapon that screamed with voices that should have driven me mad with terror. But I felt nothing. No fear, no horror, no revulsion at the corruption that radiated from him like heat from a forge. He was simply another target to be eliminated. We clashed in the shadow of the corrupted cathedral, his demon blade against my buzzing saws. He was strong and skilled, a veteran of countless battles. But I had surrendered my humanity to become pure violence, and that gave me an edge he could not match. My saw caught his weapon and sheared through it, severing the demon bound within. Before he could react, my other saw took his head from his shoulders. He died without ceremony, just another corpse added to the thousands that already littered the battlefield. The fighting continued into the night and through the next day. We cleared the cathedral level by level, burning out the corruption with holy fire and blessed steel. The word-bearers fought with desperate ferocity, knowing they had nowhere left to retreat. But we were inevitable, 12 engines of war that could not be reasoned with or frightened or turned aside. My body accumulated more damage with each engagement. Rounds tore through my abdomen, my chest, my face. I lost count of the wounds. But the pain of fresh injuries was nothing compared to the constant baseline agony I had learned to ignore. By the time the sun set on the second day, the enemy was broken and fleeing. I stood among the ruins of what had once been a place of worship, my armor covered in blood and ash. Most of the blood was mine, streaming from dozens of wounds across my exposed body. Around me lay hundreds of bodies, both enemy and civilian. I had lost count of how many I had killed, how many had died to my weapons. The numbers were too large to process, and I no longer cared to try. This was what I was now. This was my purpose. I had become exactly what they wanted me to be. The tech priests came to collect us as darkness fell completely. They moved among the squadron with tools and welding equipment, performing emergency repairs on damaged engines and tending to the pilots strapped to their frames. When they reached me, they worked in silence, their mechadendrites stitching my wounds closed with staples and surgical thread. They showed no emotion at the extent of my injuries, treating my flesh with the same clinical efficiency they applied to repairing armor plating. Sister Mara came after the tech priests had finished. She moved through the squadron as she always did, but this time she carried not just oils and prayers, but also medical supplies for the pilots. When she reached me, she paused and looked at my blood-soaked body with an expression I could not fully read through my damaged sensors. Grief, perhaps, or disappointment. She cleaned my wounds with gentle hands, applying field dressings where the tech priests had simply stapled flesh together. Her touch was careful, almost tender, treating me as a person rather than a component of the war machine. But when she looked into my eyes, I saw her expression change. She saw what I had become during the battle, the cold efficiency, the complete absence of emotional engagement with the violence I had inflicted. "Ancient Matthias," she whispered, using the title that had somehow been applied to me despite my relatively short service. "What have you become?" I tried to answer, but the speakers only produced their usual mechanical sounds. I wanted to tell her that I had become what I needed to be to survive this existence. That surrendering my humanity was the only way to endure the endless cycle of pain and battle. That the person she had hoped to reach with her kindness was being eroded away by chemicals and trauma and the simple accumulation of horrors. But I could not make the words come, and perhaps that silence told her everything she needed to know. She performed her prayers over me with particular care that day, anointing my weapons and whispering litanies that begged the Emperor to preserve whatever remained of my soul. Then she moved on to the next engine in line, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing certainty that I was losing whatever made me human. We were returned to the deep chamber beneath the cathedral, the engines chained back into our positions among the rows of screaming machines. But I no longer joined their chorus. The sounds that came from my speakers were different now, lower and more mechanical, less like expressions of suffering and more like the idle noise of machinery running on standby. Brother Gregorius in the engine next to me seemed to notice the change. His eyes, such as they were through decades of damage, tracked me for a long time. I wondered if he recognized what had happened to me because it had happened to him years ago. Time passed in the darkness. Battles came and went. I fought on worlds whose names I never learned against enemies I did not bother to identify. Orcs, tyrannids, heretics, traitors, it made no difference. They were all just targets to be burned and cut and destroyed. The chemicals became less necessary over time. I no longer needed the rage inducers to drive me forward because I had internalized the rage, made it part of my core programming. I had stopped being a person, being punished, and become a weapon that happened to contain fragments of a person's memories. One day, during a rare moment of clarity in the chamber, I tried to remember my own face. I searched my memory for the image of Brother Matthias Cord, the young man who had dedicated himself to healing the Emperor's servants. But I could not find him. The memories were still there in some technical sense, filed away in the organic portions of my brain. But they felt like records of someone else's life, a story I had been told rather than experiences I had lived. I tried to remember the faces of the soldiers I had accidentally killed, the 47 men whose deaths had brought me to this fate. Their faces were gone too, replaced by the faces of thousands I had killed deliberately in the time since. Private Marcus's final moments, once so vivid and terrible in my mind, had faded to just another entry in an endless database of death. Even my guilt, the overwhelming remorse that had driven me to choose this punishment, had been burned away by the chemicals and the violence and the sheer accumulation of horrors I had witnessed and inflicted. I realized with cold certainty that I had forgotten how to feel anything at all. The pain was still there, constant and unyielding, but it had become like the sound of my own heartbeat, something present but no longer consciously perceived. I existed in a state of permanent numbness, awareness without emotion, consciousness without self. I had become exactly what the ancient warnings spoke of. I was a weapon that could think but no longer dream. Another Penitent engine was brought to the chamber during one of my periods of awareness. The tech priests chained it into position across from me, its armor still gleaming with fresh consecration. The pilot was a young woman, newly bound to the frame, her body unmarked by battle scars. Through my sensors, I could hear her screaming, the sounds chaotic and desperate and fully conscious. She was newly transformed, still raw with the horror of what had been done to her. The other engines and I had heard these screams before dozens of times. Each new arrival brought the same terror, the same desperate hope that this nightmare would end soon. I listened to the new engine's screams with complete detachment. There was no empathy in me, no recognition of shared suffering. I simply cataloged the sounds as audio input, noting that they matched the expected patterns for a newly integrated consciousness. When Sister Mara came to perform her rounds, she paused by the new arrival and whispered something I could not hear clearly. The new engine's screams changed pitch, becoming words I could almost understand. "Please," it begged. "Please let me die." Sister Mara's response was soft but clear enough for my sensors to capture. "I cannot, child. That mercy is not mine to grant. You must serve your penance as all the others have. May the Emperor guide you through the darkness ahead." I watched this, exchange with the same emotional investment I would have given to watching rust form on metal. The new engine's suffering meant nothing to me. Sister Mara's sorrow meant nothing to me. I had lost the capacity to care about anything beyond the mechanical execution of my function. Fight, kill, burn, return to the chamber, repeat. That was my existence, and I no longer questioned or mourned it. More battles came. I lost track of how long I had been serving. The tech priests began adding purity seals to my armor, marking successful deployments and enemy kills. My body accumulated scars that the medical treatment could not fully erase, evidence of wounds that should have killed me but somehow had not. Some of the sisters began referring to me as Ancient Matthias, a title that felt absurd for someone who could barely remember being young. During one deployment, I fought beside a newly constructed Penitent engine, freshly built with improved systems and more efficient weapons. Its pilot was a former priest who had been convicted of some crime I never learned. I watched it fight with the desperate fury of the recently transformed, throwing itself at the enemy with no regard for preservation. The contrast between its wild aggression and my cold efficiency was stark. I had once fought like that, driven by chemicals and pain to mindless violence. Now I fought with calculated precision, each action optimized for maximum effectiveness with minimum wasted motion. The new engine was destroyed during the battle, overwhelmed by enemy fire that tore its pilot apart while he was still strapped to the frame. I watched him die, watched the light fade from his eyes as blood poured from wounds no body could survive, and I felt nothing. No loss for a fellow penitent, no relief that his suffering had ended, no fear that the same fate might await me. It was simply data, another casualty statistic to be reported when the battle ended. I began to wonder if I was even still conscious in any meaningful sense, or if I had become something else entirely. An artificial intelligence running on organic hardware, perhaps. A complex program that believed itself to be a person without actually possessing personhood. The question should have been terrifying, existentially devastating. But I considered it with the same flat affect I brought to everything else, and then dismissed it as irrelevant to my function. The seasons changed in the world above, though I only knew this from the temperature variations my sensors detected when I was deployed. Years must have passed, though I had no way to track them accurately. Sister Mara continued her rounds, growing older each time I saw her, her face gaining new lines and her movements becoming slower. But she never stopped coming to the chamber, never stopped offering her prayers and her small acts of compassion to the weapons that had once been faithful servants. One day she paused before me longer than usual. She looked at my scarred body, scarred, at the purity seals covering my armor, at the cold awareness behind my eyes. "Ancient Matthias," she said quietly, "do you remember why you chose this path? Do you remember the soldiers you sought to honor through your penance?" I tried to access those memories, tried to recall the guilt and grief that had driven me to accept binding to the Penitent engine. But there was nothing there, just empty space where emotions should have lived. I could remember the facts intellectually. 47 men, wrong medication, my mistake. But the feelings that had made those facts unbearable were gone, burned away by time and trauma and transformation. My speakers produced no response. Sister Mara nodded slowly as if my silence confirmed something she had suspected. She placed her hand on my shoulder one more time. "The Emperor preserve what remains of you," she whispered. Then she moved on, leaving me alone with the terrible knowledge that I had lost the very thing I had been trying to redeem. The alerts came in the middle of what passed for night in the deep chamber, pulling me from the blank state that substituted for rest. My systems activated with familiar precision, weapons priming and sensors coming online. But something was different this time. The tech priests who came to release my chains moved with desperate urgency, their prayers rushed and their hands shaking as they worked. Through the Vox network, I could hear fragmentary reports of a massive chaos incursion, a Black Crusade splinter force that had broken through the system's defenses and was now making directly for our cathedral world. All available forces were being mobilized. Every battle sister, every guardsman, every piece of war machinery that could still function was being thrown into the defense, and that included every Penitent engine in the deep chamber. They released all 12 of us from our chains, something that had never happened in all my years of service. Brother Gregorius stood to my right, his ancient chassis covered in what must have been decades of kill markings, his scarred body bearing witness to countless battles. Brother Marcus stood to my left, his weapons humming with barely contained power. We formed up in the cathedral's main courtyard as dawn broke over the city, painting everything in shades of red and gold. The chemicals flooded my system as we moved into position, but I barely noticed them anymore. They were just background noise, unnecessary additions to a consciousness that had already internalized everything they were meant to provide. I took my place in the defensive line with mechanical precision, my sensors scanning the horizon for signs of the approaching enemy. Behind me, I could hear the Sisters Repentia singing hymns of battle and penance, their voices rising toward the smoke-filled sky. Sister Mara appeared, moving along the line with tech priests who performed final checks on each engine's systems. When she reached me, she placed both hands against my shoulders, against my bare, scarred flesh rather than the engine's metal. She bowed her head in prayer. "Emperor, guide your weapons, Ancient Matthias," she said quietly. "May your service bring salvation to those who depend on your strength." Her voice carried something I had not heard before, a weight that suggested she knew this battle was different from all the others. I did not respond. I had long since stopped trying to communicate with her or anyone else. My speakers remained silent except for the low mechanical hum of my idling systems. Sister Mara stayed beside me for a moment longer, her hands warm against my cold skin, then moved on to the next engine in line. I tracked her movement through my sensors with the same detachment I brought to everything else, noting her position as simple tactical data. The enemy came with the rising sun, a tide of corruption that spilled across the Pilgrim Plaza like a flood of darkness. Chaos Marines in black and crimson armor advanced in perfect formation, supported by demon engines that walked on legs made of bone and screaming faces. Cultists swarmed around them in the thousands, ordinary humans driven mad by their worship of the dark gods. Behind them all, I could see the command element, Chaos Terminators whose armor blazed with unholy fire. The order to engage came through the Vox network, and the 12 Penitent engines moved forward as one. We advanced into the enemy tide without hesitation, our weapons lighting the morning with fire and death. My flamers carved burning paths through the cultist hordes, consuming them by the dozens with each sustained blast. My saws found Chaos Marine armor and bit deep, tearing through ceramite that had survived 10,000 years of warfare. Enemy fire poured into my exposed body. Bolter rounds punched through my chest and abdomen. A chainsword caught my arm, nearly severing it at the elbow. But I did not slow. The battle was chaos in its purest form. Explosions threw debris into the air, creating a rain of stone and metal that struck my body with bruising force. Lost fire and bolt rounds filled the space between forces, creating deadly crossfire that tore into my flesh constantly. The noise was overwhelming even through my sensors, a symphony of violence that drowned out everything else. And through it all, the 12 engines pressed forward, grinding through the enemy ranks with inexorable purpose. My systems were functioning at peak efficiency, every weapon firing in perfect rhythm, every movement calculated for maximum tactical advantage. I killed without pause or hesitation, my targeting software acquiring and eliminating threats faster than conscious thought could process. I had become the perfect weapon. All the inefficiency of emotion and doubt burned away until only pure function remained. This was what they had created me to be, and I fulfilled that purpose with mechanical perfection. But then I felt something change in my body. A sensation I had not experienced before, different from the constant pain or the impact of enemy weapons. My diagnostic systems immediately flagged multiple anomalies. Not damage from battle, but something worse. System failures cascading through my organic components. The years of chemical abuse, the constant suffering, the accumulated trauma of battles beyond counting had finally pushed my body past the point where it could continue functioning. I was dying. Not from enemy fire, though that continued to tear into me, but from the simple fact that flesh and blood were never meant to endure what I had been forced to experience. My heart was struggling to maintain rhythm. My lungs were filling with fluid from internal bleeding that had nothing to do with the current battle. The neural connectors piercing my body were causing infections that my weakened immune system could no longer fight. I could feel my consciousness beginning to compress, like slowly drowning, my awareness gradually being squeezed into a smaller and smaller space. The knowledge should have brought fear or relief or some kind of emotional response. Instead, I simply noted it as tactical data and continued fighting. An enemy Chaos Marine stepped into my path, his armor decorated with the 8-pointed star of Chaos Undivided. I burned him without slowing my advance, moving past his collapsing body toward the next target. The battle demanded my attention, and the fact that it would be my last battle seemed irrelevant compared to the immediate necessity of destroying the enemy. The fighting intensified as we pushed deeper into their formation. A demon engine, a thing of twisted metal and screaming faces, charged at me from the left. I pivoted to meet it, my saws shrieking as they met whatever passed for its armor. We grappled in the ruins of a shrine, our weapons locked together in a test of pure mechanical strength. I could feel more systems failing as I strained against it. blood vessels bursting in my brain from the pressure, my spine fracturing where the neural connectors had weakened the bone. But I held position and gradually forced it backward, my saws finding purchase and tearing into its core. It died with a sound like reality tearing, its form collapsing into ash and malice. More warnings flooded my awareness, critical failures mounting. Minutes left, maybe less. But the thought that surfaced in my consciousness was not about my own survival. Through my sensors, I could see movement at the cathedral's rear entrance. Civilians being evacuated, moving in ordered lines away from the battle. Battle sisters escorting wounded and elderly, children being carried by their parents, and among them I saw Sister Mara, her white robe standing out against the smoke and darkness. She was helping load injured civilians into evacuation transports, her face calm despite the terror of the situation. A unit of Chaos Terminators began moving to flank our position, trying to get around the Penitent engine line to reach the fleeing civilians. My targeting software tracked them, calculating trajectories and threat assessments. They were too far for my flamers to reach effectively, and my saws were useless at range. The logical action would be to maintain my position and continue engaging the enemies directly in front of me. That was my function, my purpose, the reason I existed. But something shifted deep in my consciousness. Some fragment of Brother Matthias' cord, buried under years of chemical conditioning and mechanical programming, suddenly surfaced with unexpected clarity. I saw Sister Mara helping wounded civilians, saw children running for their lives, saw all the people I had once sworn to protect and heal. And I remembered what that had meant, not as data, not as tactical information, but as something that mattered. And I chose. Not because of programming or chemical compulsion or tactical necessity. I chose because somewhere in the wreckage of what I had become there was still a person capable of making choices. I broke formation and turned the engine toward the flanking Terminators, forcing my damaged systems to move faster than they were designed to go. Alarms screamed through my awareness. My organic body was failing catastrophically. Blood poured from my nose and mouth. My vision began to blur as my optic nerves started to die, but I did not slow. The Terminators saw me coming and adjusted their formation to meet me. They were ancient warriors, veterans of the Long War, each one a match for a squad of regular Space Marines. But I was not regular anything. I was a penitent engine with nothing left to lose, driven not by chemicals but by a choice that felt more real than anything I had experienced in years. I crashed into their formation, my flamers bathing them in promethium fire hot enough to crack their thick armor. They fought back with weapons blessed by dark gods, power fists and chain axes that could tear apart tanks. One of them caught the engine's chassis with a thunder hammer, the impact shattering armor plating and crushing systems beneath. Another buried a chain axe into my torso, the teeth grinding through my ribs and into my lungs. Pain like I had never felt before, pain that transcended even the amplifiers in my spine, flooded my consciousness. But this pain was different. It was mine, chosen, meaningful. I held my position. I kept my weapons firing even as my systems failed one by one. My left flamer died first, its fuel lines severed and its promethium reserves igniting inside the chassis. My right saw seized up next, its motor burned out from overuse. But my right flamer still worked, and I used it to paint the Terminators in liquid fire, cooking them inside their ancient armor. They died slowly, and some part of me that had been dormant for so long felt satisfaction not at their deaths, but at what those deaths meant. The civilians would live. The last Terminator fell just as my heart began its final irregular beats. I could feel my consciousness fading, the organic portions of my brain losing oxygen as my cardiovascular system collapsed. But I had done what I needed to do. The flanking force was eliminated. The evacuation route was secure. Sister Mara and the civilians would make it to safety. With the last of my functioning systems, I turned the engine back toward the cathedral. The main Chaos Force was still pushing against our defensive line, trying to break through to the holy building beyond. If they succeeded, they would desecrate everything inside, turn the cathedral into a shrine of corruption. I could not allow that. I staggered forward on the engine's damaged legs, each step sending fresh damage alerts through my dying systems. My remaining flamer was down to its last reserves of promethium, but that would be enough. I positioned the engine at the main entrance to the cathedral, the only approach wide enough for vehicles and heavy equipment. If the enemy wanted to reach the building, they would have to go through me. A Chaos Rhino transport tried to do exactly that, its corrupted engine roaring as it accelerated toward my position. I waited until it was close enough that missing was impossible, then released the last of my promethium in a sustained burst that turned the vehicle into a fireball. It crashed into me at full speed, the impact finally shattering the engine's damaged chassis beyond any hope of function. The machine fell backward into the cathedral entrance, my body still strapped to its front. The impact brought down the ancient archway on top of us. Tons of blessed stone collapsed, sealing the entrance completely and burying the engine beneath the rubble. Through failing sensors, I could hear the chaos forces on the other side, trying to dig through the blockage. But it would take them hours to clear it, and by then the cathedral's defenders would have rallied. The building was safe. The pain that had defined my existence for so long began to fade, not because of any mercy or blessing, but simply because my nervous system was shutting down. The organic parts of me were dying, and for the first time in years, that meant the suffering was ending. I felt my consciousness beginning to drift like falling into deep water. Sister Mara's voice came through my Vox receivers, faint and distorted. "Ancient Matthias, can you hear me? The evacuation is complete. Everyone made it out safely because of you. Your penance is complete, brother. Emperor, receive you. Your service is ended." I tried to respond, to tell her that I understood, that I was grateful for her kindness over all the years. But my speakers were destroyed, my voice lost along with everything else. Instead, I simply let my consciousness fade, feeling something I had not felt since before my transformation. I felt like a person again, not a weapon, not an engine, not a punishment made manifest. Just Brother Matthias Cord, a healer who had made a terrible mistake and spent years trying to atone for it. In my final moments, I thought about the 47 soldiers I had accidentally killed so long ago. Their faces were still lost to me, erased by years of chemical abuse and trauma. But I remembered why their deaths had mattered, why I had chosen this path of suffering rather than the mercy of execution. It was because every life had value, every person deserved to be mourned, every death should mean something. I had lost sight of that truth when I became the engine, when I surrendered my humanity to become a more efficient weapon. But in the end, I had remembered it. I had chosen to protect the living rather than simply kill the enemy. And that choice had made my penance real. The darkness closed in completely, and I went to meet it without fear. My watch was ended. My duty was complete. Whatever waited beyond death, I would face it as Brother Matthias Cord, not as Ancient Matthias the Penitent Engine. I had been both weapon and punishment for so long that I had forgotten I could be anything else. But in that final act of choice, I had reclaimed the one thing they could not take from me unless I surrendered it willingly. I had reclaimed my humanity. The rubble that buried the destroyed engine was cleared 3 days later, after the Chaos forces had been driven back and the cathedral secured. Tech priests and recovery teams worked carefully through the fallen stone, mindful that they were handling the remains of a hero. They found the wreckage of Penitent Engine Matthias, its armor shattered and its systems cold. The pilot's body was still strapped to the front of the frame, his flesh torn and broken beyond recognition, but his face held an expression that looked almost like peace. Sister Mara supervised the recovery personally, tears streaming down her face as they carefully extracted Brother Matthias's remains from the ruined restraint cradle. The tech priests worked with unusual gentleness, treating the body with reverence rather than the clinical efficiency they usually brought to such tasks. When they finally freed him, Sister Mara wrapped the broken form in white cloth blessed with prayers and holy water. They retired the chassis to the cathedral's shrine of honored fallen, placing it in a position of prominence among the other heroes who had given their lives in the world's defense. The restraint frame stood empty now, its manacles hanging open, a silent testament to the sacrifice that had been made. A small brass plaque was mounted on the ruined armor, its words simple but carrying profound weight. Brother Matthias Cord, it read. Healer, penitent, redeemed. He chose mercy over vengeance, protection over destruction, and in choosing found his salvation. Sister Mara visited the shrine every day, bringing fresh flowers and offering prayers for the man who had endured unimaginable suffering with dignity and grace. She told the story of ancient Matthias to the younger sisters, ensuring that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. How he had broken formation to save civilians. How he had held the cathedral entrance against impossible odds. How he had died choosing to be human rather than simply functioning as a weapon. In the deep chamber beneath the cathedral, the remaining penitent engines stood in their chains, screaming their endless chorus of suffering. But one position stood empty now, the chains hanging loose where Brother Matthias had once been bound. The other engines seemed to notice the absence, their mechanical shrieks changing pitch as if in recognition of a fellow penitent who had finally found release. New battles would come, new penitent engines would be created from sinners and failures and those who chose redemption over death. The cycle would continue as it always had, grinding souls into weapons in the Emperor's eternal war. But in one small corner of that vast machinery of faith and violence, there was evidence that the cycle could be broken, that a person could endure years of torture and still choose to be more than what they had been made into. That humanity could survive even in the most inhuman of prisons. And in whatever realm awaited those who had finally laid down their burdens, the soul of Brother Matthias Cord rested at last. His sins were forgiven, his debts were paid, his suffering was ended. He had walked through the valley of the shadow of death for longer than any person should have to endure, and he had emerged on the other side with his essential self intact. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, that was the closest thing to a happy ending that anyone could hope to find. The empty restraint frame stood in the shrine like a monument, its manacles swaying gently in air currents from the ventilation systems. They would not remain empty for long. Another sinner would come. Another failure would choose penance over execution. Another consciousness would be bound into the torture of the penitent engine. But for now, for this brief moment, they stood as a memorial to the man who had occupied them. A reminder that even in the Imperium's most terrible mercy, there was still room for genuine redemption. Not through suffering alone, but through the choice to remain human despite everything designed to take that humanity away. Sister Mara placed one last white rose at the base of the ruined chassis and whispered a final prayer. Rest well, Matthias. You have earned your peace. Then she turned and walked back toward the cathedral proper, leaving the shrine to its quiet vigil. Behind her, the empty restraint frame continued its gentle swaying, marking the space where torment had once lived but lived no longer. The war would go on forever, as it always had and always would. But one soldier's battle was finally over, and in the ending, he had won.